Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. I'm delighted to be kicking off BIAZA's free lunchtime seminar series. And it's really nice to see so many people here interested in zoo science. And I've come to talk to you today about why everyone loves a zoo nerd. Bit of a flippant title, but you'll see why as I go through my talk. So basically, the overall premise of today's talk is all about science that is supporting animal care. So why do we need to use science and research in the daily husbandry, management and running of the zoos that we all love to visit? So as Frankie said, my name's Dr. Paul Rose, and I'm going to give a brief introduction to who I am and the work that I do in the zoo. And then I'm going to talk to you a bit about the reasons why we do scientific research, the types of questions that we cover, and the species that we focus on as well. And I've got a couple of examples of different projects that are ongoing in BIAZA collections at the moment that will give you an idea of why everyone really does love a zoo nerd and why they are really important to how we advance the evidence-based approach, i.e. the way in which we keep animals in the zoo. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon. As I said, my name's Paul and I am a lecturer in animal behaviour in the psychology department at the University of Exeter. And I'm also a research associate for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. So that means I facilitate the research that occurs in the living collections for WWT across all of its centres. And I'm also involved in the coordination and running of the Animal Welfare and Ethics Committee to do all of the ethical considerations of any of the manipulations or scientific research that we do with the animals that we have, both those in the living collections and those on WWT's nature reserves. So a very brief introduction to my role in the zoo, as it were. As Frankie said in her introduction, I am the Vice Chair of the BIAZA Research Committee, and we've just had our research conference earlier this month, so some of you might have been attending that, and thank you if you did. A really nice platform to showcase the scientific research that we do in British and Irish collections. I'm also involved in DEFRA's Zoos Expert Committee, so that is the body of zoo professionals that helps advise government policy and is currently involved with things like updating the Zoo Licensing Act and standards that we use for animal care in the United Kingdom. I am the co-chair of the IUCN Flamingo Specialist Group, and I'll talk a bit more about the important role of conservation and research later on. But the IUCN, being this large global body that is involved in conservation action, both in the zoo and in the wild, has a whole range of specialist groups for threatened taxa. And for those of you that love flamingos, and if you don't, then shame on you because you should, of the 6 species of flamingo, 4 of them are of conservation concern. So that's why there is a flamingo specialist group of the IUCN, of which I help run. And finally, I am the research officer for the Anseriformes tag. So Anseriformes being the ducks, geese and swans, as in my feathered friend in the photograph there. A lovely white-fronted goose, and we therefore, as a tag, a taxon advisory group, help manage these populations of birds across the European region. So that's a bit about the kind of various job roles I suppose I have in the zoo world and why I'm here today talking to you about scientific research. And one of the key things about scientific research and why we have it in the modern zoo is because it really adds value to the animals that we keep. And it's probably one of the most essential components to the running of the modern zoo. So what I'd like to do to start with is to just get everybody up to speed with what I mean by the modern zoo and how research fits into it. And what exactly do I mean by value? Because that's going to be one of the key overarching terms that I'll come back to throughout this talk. So here are some of my MSc students studying a very interested giraffe at the zoo, and they are adding value to the animal by being there, by investigating what it's doing, and by allowing the zoo to use those animals to support the 4 key aims of the modern zoo, which many of you are potentially familiar with. So conservation, education, recreation and research. Now, obviously, I'm a bit biased because I am a scientist, but I also think that research is probably the most important aim of the modern zoo in the 21st century. And there is a bit of debate at the moment about the value of these 4 aims of the modern zoo and what they actually stand for. But for me, they've always been incredibly simple. Zoos conserve species and populations, both in the collections that they hold themselves and out in the wild. Zoos do education of their visitors, both informally. You come to the zoo, you learn something about the species that you see, about their habitats, about the wider need to conserve biodiversity. And they also do more formal education, like you can see with my master's students on a specialised programme that are learning more about animal care. They provide an avenue for a good day out, which, as I think all of you are aware of, over the last 18 months has been sorely missed by most of the population. And recreation is essential to the runnings of the zoo. It's a good source of income, it explains their ideals to a wider population, and it allows them to get across the conservation, education and research messaging that they do. And I believe that underpinning the conservation, education and research aims of the zoo is research, is science, because we can't do conservation without having scientific evidence for what that conservation outcome is. We can't do education properly without evaluating it and understanding what types of education work best. And we can't give the public a good day out. We can't do recreation unless we understand our audiences. So research is a fundamental and guiding principle to the modern zoo, and it really adds to this value of why the living collection is there in the first place, because of the support that it gives to conservation, education and recreation outputs. So today, I'm hopefully going to explain to you why science is so interesting and so integral to how the zoo functions. So this rather flippant photograph that one of my very dear friends took of me rather recently, annoying this wallaby, I'm hoping that I can turn the wallaby speech bubble into a no thanks, not today, but actually, yes, please study me because I'm fabulous. And the reason as to why scientific research is really, really important, not just to how we look after that wallaby, not how to what the zoo visitor gets out of seeing that wallaby in the zoo, not just how the wallaby fits into wider conservation or educational aspects, but collectively that holistic experience of going to the zoo as a visitor and of being a stakeholder in what the zoo stands for, whether you are an animal keeper, conservation biologist, in management, in visitor services, so on and so forth. Your job role and the things that you do in the zoo will be strengthened if it's based on evidence. So today I am going to talk to you about science, and you will think it's amazing, and you will hopefully be in the shoes of the wallaby by the end of this talk, where you think it's absolutely awesome. And just to set the scene before I start and get into some examples of where the scientific approach is taking us, I would just like to give a brief historical perspective on why science supporting the zoo's mission is not necessarily new. And again, some of you might be familiar with this already. So we are approaching a very special birthday for the Zoological Society of London. So in 5 years' time, London Zoo is 200, or the ZSL, I should say, the Zoological Society of London is 200 years old. And the Zoological Society was founded on the principles of scientific investigation and the wonder of the natural world around us. And the Zoological Society opened London Zoo in 1828 as the world's first scientific zoo, to move away from the previous collections where animals were kept purely for entertainment purposes with no real study or investigation. And London Zoo and the zoos around this country that have since evolved as centres for science and research since still maintain this guiding principle of having animals in the collection that we can learn from, that we can ask questions of, and use the data from those questions to inform practice, to inform husbandry and management, and also to inform wider questions, for example, on biodiversity, conservation and sustainability of the planet. And if we move a tiny bit more closely to the present day, so we're now going to the end, towards the end of the 20th century, I hope that many of you are familiar with the works of this man, Gerald Durrell, who set up Jersey Zoo in the Channel Islands. And a pioneer of his time, Gerald Durrell really realised that it's not just a case of having animals in the zoo's collection, and it's not just a case of conservation of populations in the wild. It's bringing those two things together. It's ensuring that we have value to the living collection in the zoo and the population out in the wild, and we do conservation of both, because ultimately both of these populations are important to the future viability, i.e. how long that population is going to continue for into the future. And he published a book in 1976 called The Stationary Ark, where he talks about these guiding principles of what zoos should stand for: conservation, research, they sound familiar, captive breeding, and reintroduction. So you can see some of these early principles of what we now know as the 4 aims of the modern zoo in this book by Gerald Durrell. And I'm very, very fortunate to work at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, a conservation organisation that was founded in 1946 by Sir Peter Scott, a man of many talents who had his finger in many pies, everything from a pioneer of conservation of biodiversity to an Olympic gold medal sailor. So he really could do everything. But he realised very early on, with the likes of Gerald Durrell and Sir David Attenborough, that we really need to think about not just the animals that we go and see at the zoo, but also how they tell the story of the animals out in the wild. And it's those wild animals that we can get a lot of our information from when it comes to getting science to support what we actually do for those 4 aims of the modern zoo. So let's think about evidence, and let's think about what evidence we have and why that evidence is important. And sometimes evidence is incredibly clear. We know why animals do the things they do, or we know why they need the things they need. So I can't possibly give a zoo talk without wedging in a photograph of a flamingo and a giraffe, which in my head are the 2 best animals in the world. And hopefully you guys think the same as well. But we also have to remember that we keep a myriad of species in the zoo, not just the favourite species of the scientists that research them. So what do I mean by evidence, and that evidence being clear? Well, if I start with the flamingos as the first example, we know that flamingos turn pink from their diet. So there is evidence to what we need to provide them with in their diet in the zoo. We know that they're happiest, in inverted commas, in large flocks. So those information, or those data, provide valuable information on how we keep those animals in captivity, i.e. we need to provide them with a flock size that has a large number of individuals to allow them to perform their social behaviours and breeding behaviours. And a plug for a speaker in the future, I believe on the 30th of July, Dr. Andrew Mooney, who did his PhD on data-based animal populations, so using data to inform population sizes, will be doing one of these BIAZA talks. And one of the species that he focused on was looking at data for sustainable numbers of flamingos in captivity. So that evidence to us is clear. Then my next example of the giraffe has extreme anatomical and physiological adaptations to collect leaves from trees. They have incredibly long tongues, 45 centimeters long, and incredibly thick lips, because as you can probably see in this photograph, their favorite dinner to have in the wild are leaves from acacia trees, and acacia is covered in very sharp thorns, and therefore the giraffe has to cope with that. So the evolutionary pathway of the giraffe has created this animal that is at the fine tune of evolution for collecting and consuming leaves. So giraffes in captivity must be provided with that type of diet. And then finally, I've got a coral reef, and another lovely example of evidence and why that evidence is clear for how we manage those populations in the zoo. Corals come in 2 basic flavours, hard corals and soft corals. And both types of coral can depend on algae and other microorganisms within themselves, within the living animal itself, to generate their food. So for example, lots of the corals that you can see in that photograph are the colours that they are because of the algae and the microorganisms within the coral skeleton that allows it to photosynthesize, and that's how it generates its nutrients. So the water parameters and the light levels and everything that we provide in the managed environment not only needs to ensure that the coral itself grows, but we also need to make sure that the algae within the coral is alive as well, because that's integral to how the coral will survive into the future. And that's one of the things that zoos can have a real role to play in the future. Some of you might be aware of the coral bleaching that we have seen in parts of the world, such as the Great Barrier Reef, which is a direct cause of climatic change. And therefore, small changes to our own existence can actually help mitigate some of the impacts of climatic change, and zoo populations of corals are going to be essential in the future for restoration and reorganisation of potentially damaged reefs. However, that's all very well and good for the flamingo, the giraffe and the coral reef, where we know the evidence, we know the links to the wild, and it's quite easy for us to measure that. For some species, we might need to dig a little bit deeper because we might not have the understanding of their wants, needs or desires that allow us to recreate the natural environment in the zoo as best possible. And there are some really fundamental behaviours that we still simply don't understand. And my first of these fundamental behaviours is illustrated by the photograph of those 4 whooper swans, a species very dear to the hearts of many people that work at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, because we manage nature reserves to encourage whooper swans to winter here in the United Kingdom, flying all the way from their breeding grounds in Iceland to spend the relatively nicer conditions of the winter. I suppose if you are a swan that comes from Iceland, the winter here is better than the winter in Iceland, in the relative safety of those nature reserves. But the reason why I'm using this as an example is we still don't know whether or not birds like flying. Do birds need to fly? Do birds want to fly? What does a bird get from flying, apart from moving from one place to another? We know that birds on islands lose the power of flight incredibly quickly. So birds that evolve in isolation lose the powers of flight because flight is incredibly energy costly. So what does that tell us about the motivation of that behaviour in captivity? And I can't answer that question for you. But also, if we think about migratory species, how do they cope with living in the zoo? How does the zoo's environment, no matter how good it is and how naturalistic it is going to curtail any potential urges that species have to move at certain times of the year? So how do we deal with that with our husbandry and management? I can't answer that question for you either. And then we move on to species that might appear familiar to us. We all know what a fish is, but when it comes to looking at animal welfare states and how we measure and understand welfare, we are still only scratching the surface in mammals and indeed in higher mammals like primates. So there is a lot to be learned about quality of life and welfare assessment of, and I hate to use the phrase lower vertebrate, but for anything that's not a mammal and not well studied, we're still very unfamiliar with the physiological, psychological and behavioural components of welfare that allow that animal to do well in the zoo. So the fish, which is the example here, is a firemouth cichlid from Central America, an incredibly intelligent species, an incredibly long-lived species, very specific territorial behaviours, very specific pair bonds, has a whole suite of behaviours that have evolved particular to a type of environment to allow it to do particular things. We need to consider all of that evolutionary history and how the animal interacts with the environment around it when it comes to thinking, how do we even start measuring the welfare of fish in the zoo? And right at the start of my talk, I mentioned how integral people are to the running of the zoo. We do conservation with buy-in from other human beings. Conservation is all about people. We need to get them on board to make sure conservation action is successful. We do education of our visitors to explain important information to them and hopefully to enact human behaviour change. And we also encourage our visitors to the zoo for a nice day out. But what is the actual effect of visitors on the animals that they are looking at or engaging with? We know there is a visitor effect. Work that has been around since the 1970s has suggested that some animals respond positively to the presence of visitors. The majority of animals don't seem to really care about the presence of visitors unless something drastic changes around them. And then few species can engage negatively to the visitors around them. They might withdraw or become shy. But recent work has shown that the visitor effect seems to be much more complex than that. It's balanced out by changes in weather, climate, density, sound, a whole range of other factors that impact on the animal's perception of visitors. So do we need to revisit some previous work that we thought told us exactly the answer to that question and look at it with fresh eyes in terms of what we now know about how animals might respond to the environment around them. So what we need to do in the zoo is make sure we know exactly what we know. Make sure we understand why we are caring for the animal in that particular manner, so that what we're providing it with is measurable, biologically relevant, and actually useful to it. So the first of my zoo nerds that I'm going to introduce you to today is my MSc student, Zoe, who is not only a student, but she's also a full-time zookeeper. And she looks after browsing ungulates, such as okapi, which you can see behind her in the photograph, and giraffe. And her MSc project is all about this idea of giving animals browse, so browse are cut tree branches, to forage on. For a long time, we thought this was simply environmental enrichment. You hang up some browse for the giraffes, gives them something to do. But remember what I said to you earlier about the giraffe's anatomy and physiology. The giraffe has evolved to eat leaves. They are integral to how it lives its daily life. So browse in the zoo is not enrichment. It's a way in which we keep the animal happy, healthy, contented, and in a good quality of life. So Zoe's project is not only looking at what types of tree leaves do we feed to the giraffe that keeps them amused for the longest, but how long is the latent effect of that browse that is given? How long do the beneficial behaviours associated with browsing last for in those individuals once the tree leaves have been eaten? So we need to make sure we know what types of browse are useful. How do we quantify how much they're eating? And how do we quantify the long-term positive impacts from that husbandry practice on the giraffe? So this is using evidence to provide the reasoning why we do that in the zoo. And when we collect those data and we apply those data to the zoo, we must make sure that we're using that research for the benefit of the animals. And every year, BIAZA runs an awards scheme where you can submit projects that have been undertaken in the zoo across a whole range of topics, from animal behaviour to research to education to husbandry and so on and so forth. And this year at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, with my colleague, Dr. Michelle O'Brien, who's Head of Veterinary Services for WWT, we submitted an award for the Animal Behaviour and Welfare category that was looking at measuring welfare in these species where welfare assessment might be difficult. And we were looking at how we could possibly measure both the physical, behavioural and psychological health of ducks, geese and swans. How can we measure what the animal gets from the environment that impacts on its quality of life? How can we measure characteristics of the animal itself? Is this swan moody? Is this swan animated? Is this swan outraged? Who knows? But what can you get from the animal's behavioural expression, i.e. the things that it will do that can give you an underlying understanding of its welfare state that we can then put into practice? Can we change husbandry and management, change enclosure design to actually promote these positive behavioural expressions? And then we can look at overall behavioural states as well. So what is the animal doing with its time when we are looking at it to give us an idea of how motivated it is to do things? And we ran this project at WWT Slimbridge, at WWT Arundel down in West Sussex, and at WWT Washington up in Tyne and Wear. And we've collected a whole range of data across different species of ducks, geese and swans to work out the best way of doing an holistic measure of welfare in what is a relatively commonly kept group of birds. That study is published in the journal Animals, and we have created a welfare assessment tool that can be used by not only people in the zoo world, but also people in private practice as well, who can score the welfare of their birds, make changes based on what their welfare scoring system might tell them to hopefully positively benefit the quality of life of the animals. And I'm very pleased to say that the whole team involved in that across those 3 WWT centres was able to win a gold award in the animal behaviour and welfare category in this year's BIAZA Awards. And we can also do really species-specific focuses on the research that we use to benefit animals as well. So this is my colleague Ricardo, who is doing his PhD on parrot enclosure design and parrot behaviour. And some of you that are familiar with the BIAZA Research Committee's Facebook page will know Ricardo very well. He helps me with the social media for the Research Committee, and he was also really helpful with the running of this year's conference. So a big shout out to him. But before Ricardo started his PhD on parrots, he was also interested in small, unusual species in the zoo, and published a paper from his MRes, his Masters by Research, that was looking at mouse deer, which is not a mouse nor a deer, a very small type of ungulate from Asia. And he compiled a global husbandry survey of the management of several species of mouse deer across a whole range of zoos. And those results are published in the journal Applied Animal Behaviour Science. And he was able to understand from these data that he collected what features were most important to mouse deer within their enclosure that promoted beneficial behaviours. And one of those really key findings that he had was the usefulness of having areas of water, natural type water in the animal's environment to recreate pools that it might use in its wild habitat. So a small change that is based on science makes a big difference to the animal in the zoo. And then to bring that up to speed, my next zoo nerd is Jess Harley, who was the former chair of the BIAZA Research Committee. And Jess helps out with the research and welfare scoring for the Amur leopard studbook. So I mentioned right at the start of this presentation that I am a member of the Anseriforms tag for BIAZA, BIAZA being the large European zoo organisation that works with zoos in Europe and in other areas of the globe as well, has all of these different taxon advisory groups that allow us to manage animals in a particular way. Jess is involved with the studbook and coordination of the population through BIAZA, and is currently putting together a husbandry survey that is collecting data on the population management of the Amur leopard, which is unfortunately teetering on the brink of extinction, is threatened by a whole range of industrial development out in the wild. So the zoo population is integral to its survival in the future. And the reason that I am showing you these two examples together is because we can use this husbandry survey approach for everything from the teeny tiny mouse deer, which is very unusual to see in the zoo and sometimes hard to study in the wild, to even these more familiar species. We've had leopards in captivity for a very long time, but we still need to refine and optimize their husbandry and management. And Jess is a bit of a carnivore expert, has just published a paper on fossas, which is that endemic Madagascan carnivore, which are the result of another husbandry survey. And again, that is available in the open access journal of Zoological and Botanical Gardens. And it gives you an idea just of the output of these husbandry surveys and how valuable they are at putting this research to use for future husbandry and management of those populations. And sometimes when we ask scientific questions, and in fact, if you're anything like me and my scientific research, the science that you do will leave you completely baffled because you don't actually know what you've done, and therefore you might have to go and ask that question again, because sometimes we don't necessarily know what we don't know. So scratching the surface enables us to know exactly what we don't know, so that we then do further investigation. So this is another example of a project from the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. So this is my former colleague, my former student and current colleague, Jack. He's the one at the back of the photo. And he is the amphibian keeper at Slimbridge. And I've just put a picture of him holding a Buick Swan there because I couldn't find a picture of him holding a frog. So here is a picture of the frog. And Jack worked incredibly hard over the COVID lockdown, when zoos were forced to close, when the furlough scheme had kicked in, and when there were reduced staffing levels at many of the zoos across the United Kingdom. Being someone from a scientific background and realising the value of this closure to our understanding of what the animals get from being in a managed environment, Jack, myself, and Dr. Michelle O'Brien, who I introduced to you in a previous slide, collected data on the activity, the enclosure usage of several species of frog, toad, and newt housed at WWT Slimbridge to see the overall effect of the closure on their activity levels. And we were able to show that there were species differences in response to the presence of people. Some species came out more, were more visible with reduced visitor numbers. Some species habituate very quickly to the presence of visitors, so that when the zoo or the living collections at Slimbridge reopened towards the end of the lockdown last summer, these frogs and toads reduced their visibility at the start of that reopening, but then came back to pre-closure levels. And this is really important information for collection planning, because we can change the types of species that we house based on the traffic, the visitor traffic that goes past the enclosure. We can alter the collection plans accordingly and the enclosure design that we give to those animals to make them feel more comfortable when they're being observed by the visitors that are coming to the zoo. And again, this is not just for potentially understudied or unusual species in captivity. So we are really pushing on the BIAZA Research Committee more studies into reptiles, amphibians, fish and invertebrates, because they are relatively understudied taxa. But there are also familiar species to us, such as these lechwe, which are a type of antelope, that are relatively common in zoos, yet don't get that much research attention. And again, a study that I was involved in that was published earlier this year that looked at the effects of husbandry on two species of lechwe, the red lechwe, which you can see in the photograph, and the Nile lechwe, which is a slightly different colour, across zoos in AZA, so the American Zoo region, and across BIAZA, has really highlighted the importance of why we might need standardised husbandry practices for some species. This survey of lechwe husbandry told us what a range of different zoos do, so we can then pick out the most biologically relevant aspects of that husbandry and management to benefit all lechwe populations in all zoos by sharing that good practice more widely. So what I would just kind of like to finish with are just some examples of how we can move forwards with research, and to give some concluding thoughts on Paul's kind of crazy brain as to where zoo animal research questions should go in the future. So I just said to you that a big push in the research committee at the moment across the BIAZA region is to diversify the taxonomic groups that we investigate. And one of those really challenging taxonomic groups, particularly from an animal welfare perspective, is looking at the welfare requirements of fish. Now, I have kept tropical fish for a very long time, and they are something that lots of people might be familiar with in terms of you get your fish tank, you set it up, you buy some fish and they look very pretty. But we don't necessarily know exactly about the types of behaviours that those fish need to perform, about the types of environment that they might come from in the wild, and therefore how we mesh that together in the aquarium, that managed habitat where we're controlling everything, lighting, filtration, heating, water parameters, everything in that 3D box that we provide for those fish is directly controlled by us. And yet we can be lacking in the information that we have to understand their care. So this is my idea of potential fish welfare and where it should go from a research perspective in the future. So what I've done is broken down ways in which we could consider measuring fish welfare into three basic categories. In green, I have got physical traits that might tell us about the welfare state that these rainbow fish are in. So we know that fish lose their colour when they're stressed, and we know that fish change colour when they're directing behaviours to different individuals. So colour change relevant to that species is a good welfare measure, or a potential good welfare measure, I should say. How fish swim in the water, how they orient themselves in the water column, that also tells us a lot about animal welfare. For those of you that have ever kept fancy goldfish, so those domesticated types of goldfish that come in a whole range of shapes, sizes and colours, they can often go off balance because of that selective breeding to create a particular shape of fish. How does that impact on that animal's quality of life? The fact that you struggle with the basic behaviour that you have been evolved to do, which is swimming, orienting yourself in the water column, does that tell us about underlying welfare state? We can also look at fin position as well, because fish use fins not just for swimming, not just for movement, but for display, for other forms of communication, and to tell messages to others around them. And therefore, we have got all of these ideas of physical health, the structure and continuity of the fish's integument, its skin and scales, whether or not its fins are shredded or in good physical condition. All of those things link to the physical underlying health of the animal, which will impact on welfare. In blue, I've got my potential behavioural considerations of fish welfare. So how is the ease of movement when the fish swims around its fish tank? It forages at the surface, it forages in the substrate. Does it perform that behaviour without any hindrance? What are the behavioural norms of this species? Rainbow fish come from fast-flowing streams of New Guinea and Australia. Do we provide that environment in the zoo that allows the fish to swim in the way that we might see in the wild, if those data exist for comparison? How do the fish use their resources? Are the woods and planting and lighting in this aquarium suitable for the types of rainbow fish that are being held? And therefore, does that impact on behaviour? Some fish produce sound, and for a totally unrelated piece of work, I happened to be investigating this, and I came across a paper that told me, and this is my pub quiz fact of the day that you can take away with you, if you so wish, that piranha, of all species, produce 3 different types of sound. They squeak when they're angry at another individual, and they make the same squeak when they're captured in a net, which if I was a piranha and captured in a net, I probably would be angry, and therefore I would squeak. And they also make a whole range of more complex noises when they're directing both agonistic, so aggressive, and affiliative, so shoaling behaviours to one another. And they make these sounds with a combination of the muscles around their swim bladder, which is the organ that allows the fish to orient itself in the water column, and using the bones in their jaws as well. So fish are incredibly complex animals. And if they can produce a range of sounds that link to particular behaviours, and then that links to particular behavioural states, we really need to be investigating these species in more detail in the future. And then finally, can we look at personality and any psychological responses to animal welfare in the fish? Social choice, for example, we know that that's a real key driver of positive welfare in mammals. You guys as humans, you're all mammals, your social choice over who you interact with and who you avoid is really key to your underlying welfare state. Should we look at that in fish? What about individual personality differences? We know that fish have individual personalities. I go back to my firemouth cichlid that I talked about earlier on. Cichlids, a group of species predominantly from South and Central America, are incredibly individual in their personality because of how highly cognitive they are in their abilities of processing information and learning new skills. So personality, individuality, and social choice might be psychological measures that we are able to use to consider exactly how we go about measuring fish welfare in the future. Now, I'm not going to pin my colours to the mast of any of these at the moment. This is just an example of what we could consider measuring with fish welfare. So what we basically need to do with all of this science that we do in the zoo is to build bridges for the benefit of everybody involved, all stakeholders. As I mentioned right at the start of this talk, we have got really nice examples of the zookeepers, of the zoo goers, of the zoo managers, of the conservation biologists, of everybody that is involved in the day-to-day running of the zoo, that can get involved in scientific research and use the output of that scientific research to better advance animal care. And just an example from the work that I do across my 2 organisations, so the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and the University of Exeter, one of my key research threads is on the behaviour and welfare of captive flamingos, one of the commonest of all zoo-housed animals. So the application of those results has impact across a wide range of individuals. So the more I do at the university, the benefits the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, benefits the birds, and the fact that I can go to the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust to study the birds benefits the impact of that science from the university. So it's collaboration, not competition, and it's working together to ensure we can answer these really fundamental questions. And those fundamental questions are essential to us being able to understand the potential impacts of climatic change, the potential impacts of what is happening in the unsustainability of the lives of us as human consumers on the planet, and how going to the zoo and having opportunities for human behaviour change in the zoo can benefit these bigger global questions. If animals behave in a more natural or normal fashion, their welfare is good, then your experience at the zoo is improved, is better. You're more likely to take away a better take-home message that is going to convince you of the value of the animals, of the value of the zoo, and of the value of the zoo's mission. So this research into animal behaviour is really important to the underlying role of the zoo in enacting wider human behaviour change to answer, as I said, these bigger global questions. And this is just a photograph of the London Wetlands Centre, which was opened by the Wildflower Wetlands Trust in the year 2000. And its aim was to bring nature into the heart of one of the world's largest capital cities. And again, I'm very fortunate at the Wildflower Wetlands Trust in that we have some social scientists that work alongside of the animal nerds like me. And those social scientists are interested in the habitats and the functions of those habitats and what people get out of those habitats. So that when we're creating these environments that benefit animals, we're benefiting people as well. And the Wildflower Wetlands Trust has this idea of blue prescribing, so improving human health and well-being by getting people out there into wetland environments, which ultimately improves mood, improves physical health, and it improves psychological health as well. And this crossover between different scientific disciplines is going to come more and more important as to how we answer these complex research questions in the future. So this is not me of a photograph of the 1980s asking for their headphones back. This is me doing my postdoc, which was research that I did after my PhD at the University of Exeter in conjunction with Bristol Zoo and Paignton Zoo. And I was part of a project called Listening to the Zoo, which had an anthropologist involved, social scientists involved, an expert in ethics involved, and then me as the animal behaviour scientist, with this cross-disciplinary group of people that were measuring human responses to the sound environment of the zoo, the animals' responses to the sound environment of the zoo, and then merging the two together. And that creates a data set that tells us not only about how the animals are perceiving their care in the zoo, but also how is that being impacted by humans, and likewise, what are the humans getting from what they experience, not just by looking, but also by hearing the environment of the zoo that they're going to. So this idea of building bridges to benefit everybody is one of the key future challenges of the zoo and the research that we're doing. So to summarise what I've said to you folks today, we don't have plastic animals in the zoo. We don't have animals that are static, like my model giraffe and elephant in this photograph. We have animals that are the result of a continuing process of evolution, that are the current embodiment of that adaptation and evolutionary pressure. And therefore, when we conserve these species and populations, we are conserving that adaptive potential. That's why we need to work together to ensure that our husbandry and management is ecologically and biologically sound. Because one day, if we're putting animals back into the wild, we are rewilding habitats and restocking populations. We need to make sure that they can cope and behave in a way that is in line with the functioning of that ecosystem. And this is where this comparison of the wild and captivity is, in my head, really, really important. And this is a paper that I published earlier this year in the journal Birds, which was talking about the evidence for aviculture, the evidence for how we keep birds of all sorts of species in zoo-housed populations. And I've just taken this graph out of it, partly because it's on flamingos, but also because it shows you this really nice comparison of the zoo and the wild. This is a meta-analysis, which is a review of the literature of data on what wild flamingos do and what captive flamingos do. And you can see for the most part, these time budgets, so the amount of time spent on the behaviour in the wild and in the zoo, is relatively similar. Apart from zoo flamingos spend more time being inactive than wild flamingos. So we know we've got a behavioural difference there. What we don't know is the impact of that behavioural difference. So this is where I would use these data to forward that scientific question, to do more science, to collect more data, to find out, does it really matter that my zoo flamingo is less active than my wild flamingo? And if it does matter, What can I do about it? And therefore, when we put all of that together, we really add more value to the relevance of that population going into the future. And my final zoo nerd to introduce you to is one of my favourite people to collaborate with. This is Dr. Lisa Riley. She's the one in the grey cardigan. She won't mind me saying that, I hope. And she's an expert in all things great ape, particularly chimpanzees. And one of Lisa's key research themes is this idea that we don't just conserve behaviour, we don't just conserve what animals do, we conserve the value, there's my favourite word again, the value of that behaviour to the population. And we call that behavioural culture, or the conservation of culture. Chimpanzees have really strong cultures based on the particular populations they come from. Therefore, in the zoo, we need to give them the outputs for those types of behaviours to perform that culture so that we don't lose that in the future. Not all chimpanzees break nuts open with rocks. Not all chimpanzees fish for termites from termite mounds. So what is it about those particular populations that make them do that behaviour, that then we can use that knowledge to conserve that behaviour in the future? And that type of approach is essential to the sustainability of our zoo populations in the future. It makes them more robust, more able to breed if they're being kept in a biologically relevant manner. It fulfills these long-term conservation objectives that come from bodies like the IUCN that I mentioned right at the start. It allows us to improve animal care by giving the animal an environment that's more complex and dynamic. And as I said before, it improves all stakeholder experiences. Everybody from the visitor that gets a more interesting day out to the population manager and zoo curator that has an easier time of looking after those species. And that's not just for my higher primates like the chimpanzee. These are archerfish, which have this amazing ability to shoot insects out of the air with a jet of water. And the amazing thing about archerfish is that they're not only able to judge the refraction and reflection by being in the water and looking at something in air, they also teach each other how best to shoot down insects. Smaller archerfish learn the best ways of collecting prey from larger archerfish. And this social network, all of the different types of social interactions that the fish have, is really important to it becoming efficient in its foraging behaviour. So just like my chimpanzee cracking the nut open with the rock, so the archerfish needs the same type of considerations from a behaviour and a behavioural culture perspective when we keep it in the zoo. So thank you so much for listening to me this afternoon and for coming along in your lunch break. I'd like to thank a whole raft of people that are involved in the scientific research that I do across many different sample populations and many different collections. And thank you very much to BIAZA for allowing me the opportunity to come and open this seminar series for them. So I'll just stop sharing and come back to the main screen.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Paul. I think we can all agree that was a really interesting and comprehensive coverage of everything zoo researchy. In fact, it was so comprehensive that we don't actually have any questions for you. So well done. You've answered all possible.
It's probably because I'm the only person standing in the way of all these people and their sandwiches. That's what it is.
Either way, we'll take it. Thank you very much for that, Paul. That was excellent. As I said at the beginning, we have recorded the talk, so once we've sort of got the hang of our own YouTube channel, we'll be able to get this up and loaded, and I'll make sure it gets sent out in an email and hopefully put on our social media channels as well. Oh, I tell a lie, we've had a question come through from Lisa for you, Paul. She says, what is the fundamental thing zoos can do to make populations more sustainable?
Oh, that's a really interesting question and an incredibly big question. So thanks, Lisa, for putting me on the spot there. I think we know from some of the research that has been conducted in the past that if we allow animals more freedom over who breeds with whom, and we really integrate mate choice into conservation planning and conservation action, so we don't just marry individuals up based on their genetic pedigree, we allow them to get the mechanism of sexual selection, which is fundamental to mate choice in the population, that ultimately increases the viability of youngsters. So I think more research into how do we embed animal behaviour traits into conservation planning is a really good first step in understanding how do we make currently reproductively dormant populations, or populations where reproduction is at a low level, more sustainable into the future.
Fantastic, thank you. A good answer to a big question. I think we can we can all agree. Fantastic. We haven't had any other ones come through. So just to do a quick plug, our next BIAZA Brings You session will be this Friday. It's Dr. Andrew Mooney. You can find all the details on the BIAZA website on the events page. And again, just drop me an email if you'd like to register for that one and you haven't yet. But otherwise, just to say thanks again to Paul for giving up your lunch break. Hopefully you can go and have a sandwich yourself now. And we're looking forward to seeing you all in future sessions. So thanks very much.